Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Mariancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 7. As always, they're intended for half PPR leagues, but before we get into it, I'm going to mention the players I did not rank due to bye and injury. The Bears and Cowboys are on bye this week, so no CeeDee Lamb or Jalen Tolbert in the rankings. Same goes for DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen. You can't start any of them, but Nico Collins remains on IR. Same with Rashee Rice, Marquise Brown, Adam Thielen, and Brandon Cooks. And it looks like Puka Nacua will remain on IR as well, at least until Week 8, but it looks like Cooper Kupp is trending towards playing in Week 7. So at least we get one of them back, but in New Orleans, we're not getting either player available this week. Both Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed have already been ruled out for that game against Denver. Olave has a concussion, so no chance he plays on Thursday, and Shaheed is going on IR. He's getting knee surgery to repair a meniscus injury that he suffered last week. So terrible news for the Saints, and all of those players on the screen are not included in these rankings. Let's get going though at number 1, where I have Justin Jefferson versus Detroit. He's always a lock in your lineup, but in this matchup, you could say he owns the Lions. In his last 5 games versus Detroit, Jefferson is averaging 22.9 points per game, 11.8 targets per game, 8.6 catches per game, 150 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns. He is on fire, and I think he's going to absolutely go off in this matchup. I think the Vikings win, and Jefferson is a big reason why. So you cannot bench him. The matchup also ranks top 4. The Lions give up 211 wide receiver yards per game, and that is by far and away the most in the NFL. So Jefferson, a lock in your lineup, the wide receiver 1 in Week 7. Number 2, I have Malik Nabers versus the Eagles, who I think will play. He's feeling much better after missing 2 games with a concussion, and he also gets an elite matchup here. The Eagles rank top 6 against wide receivers in their last 5 games. They allow 32.3 points per game on about just under 12 catches for 162 yards per game with 8 touchdowns to the position. So Nabers will definitely find the end zone. I think he could explode, honestly. This is the Saquon revenge game, but I do think the Giants will put up an excellent fight. And to counter the embarrassment of Saquon probably torching them, I think Nabers could see legitimately 20 targets. Over his last 4 games, he is averaging 13 targets per game, 18.5 points per game, and he's a lock this week. I think he's a guaranteed top 5 play at the position. You cannot bench Malik Nabers coming off of the concussion. Number 3, I have Cooper Kupp versus Las Vegas, who I was tempted to rank number 1 because the last time we saw him play without Puka Nacua in a full game, he had 21 targets, 14 catches, 120 total yards, and a touchdown. He scored 25 points in half PPR back in Week 1. However, coming off the injury, I'm not totally convinced they force feed him 20 plus targets again. So that's why I don't have him at number 1. But at number 3, I think he's a guaranteed start. I think the matchup, while it does rank top 10, is completely irrelevant here. Stafford will get one of his favorite targets going early and often, and Kupp is a lock to find the end zone. As long as he's active, he's a must start. He's a top 5 play this week. Number 4, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown at the Vikings, who gets a top 3 matchup here. The Vikings give up a lot of yards to the receiver position, 209 yards per game on average over the last 5. So really good spot here. There's usually some garbage time, or at least good game script, to be throwing the ball against Minnesota this season, and I do think St. Brown will capitalize. He's been a little bit of a letdown in fantasy this year due to the emergence of Jameson Williams. However, he is still their number 1 target, and he is emerging lately. In his last 4 games, he does average 14.9 points per game on only 9.3 targets, only 7 catches for 69 yards, but he has also scored 3 touchdowns, and I think that's guaranteed to hit once again. In this matchup, I could easily envision a shootout, and he also plays very well against the Vikings. In his last 5 games versus Minnesota, an average of 17.2 points per game, 10.8 targets per game, 8.2 catches for 95 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns. He'll be fine. I'm not worried about St. Brown. I just think Jameson Williams is close to being on his level. Not quite the same, but much better than we anticipated. Number 5, I have A.J. Brown at the Giants, who's only played in 2 games this year. I think the fact that you had to wait for him for several weeks is a reason why you're never benching him. However, if we look at his last 4 full games against New York, including the playoffs, he's only averaging 10.3 points per game, 8.3 targets, 4.3 catches for 67 yards per game, only one touchdown in this 4-game sample size. So there is a world where he is not elite in this matchup. I could envision them overcompensating for the Saquon Barkley revenge narrative and just funneling him the ball like crazy and not getting the other players involved enough. But AJ Brown has been lights out when active this year, an average of 20.5 points per game with at least 115 yards in each of those games, a touchdown in each as well. So he has been so good. You drafted him super high, you're never benching him, but I'm not convinced he's like the wide receiver 1 on the week. This matchup has been a bit tricky for him in his career with the Eagles. Number 6 and 7 though, also some locks in your lineup. The two Bucs wide receivers, I have Chris Godwin and Mike Evans back-to-back versus Baltimore this week. And why I'm so confident in both is because this is the number 1 matchup this season. The Ravens, over the last 5 games, give up 38 points per game to wide receivers on average. 14.8 catches per game for just under 200 yards per game and 9 wide receiver touchdowns only over the last 5 weeks. So very good odds both players find the end zone, and they're both locks in your lineup pretty much every week. I know that Mike Evans is coming off a bad game, but he only played in 57% of snaps last week against the Saints. He would have probably gone off in that blowout win if healthy, but assuming he plays, which it sounds like he will, he's already off the injury report, I think he bounces back in a major way with definitely at least 1 touchdown. But both players have scored 4 touchdowns this season. They're both playing very well, and Godwin is my preferred option. This season, Godwin is averaging 17.1 points per game on 8.8 targets per game. Meanwhile, Evans is averaging 12.3 points per game on 7 targets per game. So Godwin is younger. He's emerging in a contract season as the number 1 option, but Evans is very close behind him. They're both excellent plays, and I think this week in the best matchup possible, they both find the end zone. They're both top 10 plays. I think you would be a fool to bench either Godwin or Evans moving forward. Number 8, I have Jamar Chase versus Cleveland, who gets a top 7 matchup here. The Browns have given up 8 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 5 weeks. However, 3 of them are rushing touchdowns. So I'm not totally convinced it's like as good of a matchup as it appears to be on paper. And if you look at this career matchup for Jamar Chase against the Browns, he's not that good. In 5 career games, only an average of 8.9 points per game on 9.4 targets, 5.4 catches per game, only 50 yards per game, and only 1 touchdown in this 5-game sample size. So Denzel Ward actually holds him in check. He has struggled in the past to play well against Cleveland. So not expecting him to have his best game on the season, but he has been elite over the last 4 games. Jamar Chase ranks as the wide receiver 1 in this sample size with an average of 22.2 points per game, 7.8 targets, 6 catches per game, 117 yards per game, and 5 total touchdowns. He's been lights out so far. However, he's also been getting oddly fewer targets than T. Higgins since Higgins has returned from injury, and that's what could be a problem here. I think it will be more balanced between the two, and while I do think the Bengals win, I'm not convinced they have to drop like 45 points in order to do that. I think they can beat the Deshaun Watson Browns with just like 20 points on the scoreboard. So it could kind of look like last week against the Giants. I'm not convinced Jamar Chase is the best receiver to start this week, but he's never a player you're benching. He's definitely top 10 at the worst. And this week he ranks at number 8. Number 9, though, I have Drake London versus Seattle, who's been balling out lately in his last 4 games, an average of 17.2 points per game. That's on par with Chris Godwin this year. 11 targets per game, 7.5 catches per game, 90 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns. He is clearly Kirk Cousins' favorite weapon. So the hope that we had entering the season that he would turn into a top 12 wide receiver appears to have worked out. It looks like he's finally living up to his potential. And with this connection with Kirk Cousins, I don't think you can ever bench him. I think he's a lock in your lineup every single week. The matchup against the Seahawks isn't the best on paper, but it's not a downgrade either. Devon Witherspoon, though, is a very legit corner, and I could see a little bit of risk with London this week, but he's played so well lately, I don't think you can move off of him. I think at home, the Falcons will win this game, and London will be a big reason why. I'm definitely starting him every single week, rest of season. This week at number 9. Number 10, though, Davante Adams moving over to the Jets is a must start. I think he's top 10, and obviously all it took was a trade to the Jets for his hamstring to heal itself, and he's already practicing in full. You're not worried about it. He will play on Sunday night. And the matchup, while it does rank bottom 10, kind of feels irrelevant. It's just a question of how will the target distribution look like between him and Garrett Wilson. Adams, I think, will be the clear number one. His contract is a big reason why, but obviously he has far better chemistry that's been established for over a decade, it feels like, with Aaron Rodgers, and you know he's going to find the end zone. That's what was his bread and butter back in his Packer days. So I think the floor is guaranteed for Adams this week. I think the touchdown opens the ceiling for 20+ points, and I think he's a must start moving forward. He's a top 10 wide receiver almost every week now that he plays with Aaron Rodgers, and he's happy to be out of Vegas. Number 11, though, I have Jayden Reed versus Houston, who's technically questionable at the moment. He did tweak his ankle last week and briefly left the game, but he returned and finished it. I'm not worried about it. I do think he will play. And in 4 games with Jordan Love this season, Jayden Reed is averaging 19.6 points per game on only 6.5 targets per game, but he does get some work in the run game as well. 5.3 catches for 109 yards per game total, and 4 touchdowns this season with Love. He is clearly their number one wide receiver, and with his dual threat ability, he's a chess piece on a similar level as Deebo Samuel. I think he's a must start every single week, and against Houston, I rank him here at number 11. Number 12, I have Zay Flowers at Tampa, who gets a top 8 matchup. The Bucks allow over 30 points per game to wide receivers in their last 5, and 17 catches per game, 186 yards per game, 6 wide receiver touchdowns over that sample size is a very high floor we can expect from Zay Flowers. He will play well. While he does have a couple bad games this year, both of them happened in blowout wins. Game script is the only risk for Zay Flowers, it feels like. And otherwise, he is averaging 10.5 targets per game. The volume has been there. In his last 2 straight games, he has gone over 100 yards. Last week, 134 against Washington. So I really trust him. I think he's earned must-start status this season, and this game could be a potential shootout. I think it will be competitive throughout. I do not think the game script will go away from him in this matchup. So Flowers will consistently be involved on Monday night. The matchup is good, and while he isn't a great bet to score a touchdown this season, only 1 on the year, I think it's a game where they need him to step up. I got a feeling about Zay this week. I think he's an excellent play versus Tampa. I do think he finds the end zone. So start him with confidence. I want Flowers in my lineup. Number 13, I have Terry McLaurin versus the Panthers. The matchup is top 12. Carolina in their last 5 games give up just over 29 points per game with 8 wide receiver touchdowns in the last 5 games. So Terry is red hot right now. I think he will continue this touchdown streak. And in his last 4 games, he is averaging 16.1 points per game on 7.8 targets, 5.3 catches, 80 yards per game, and 4 touchdowns. He scored 2 of them last week. So he is red hot. I cannot bench him. And at some point, the touchdown streak might come to an end, but the Panthers do not have enough to stop him. So I'm not expecting him to slow down this week. I think he'll play very well. The matchup suggests he will find the end zone with ease once again. And the only concern I have for him is that Carolina's run defense is just so atrocious that every touchdown this week might come on the ground instead. But that's an unlikely hypothetical to worry about. I'm not going to stress over it. I'm starting Terry with just as much confidence as Zay Flowers. Number 14 and 15, though, I have Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell back-to-back here at the Packers. With Nico Collins on IR, both Texans wide receivers are very good starts every week, but Diggs has been pretty good all year long, averaging 13.8 points per game. Diggs in his last 4, though, has bumped it up to 14.6 on 9 targets per game, 6.8 catches per game, 82 yards per game and 2 touchdowns. He has a very high floor, and the touchdown feels like a very safe bet with no Nico Collins. Yeah, Jair Alexander isn't the best matchup you could ask for, but it's not enough to fully scare me away. I think Diggs is a must start no matter what, while Nico Collins is out. Number 15, right behind him, I got Tank Dell, as mentioned, and I really trust him just as much as Diggs while Nico is out. It feels like a 1A, 1B situation as both players try to replace Collins, and this game could be a very high-scoring shootout. Dell did have more targets last week. 9-7 was the split against the Patriots. So they both scored a touchdown. I could easily see that happening on a weekly basis. I think Diggs, Dell, and Mixon probably score every week moving forward. So trust both of them. I think they're both excellent starts, and Tank Dell has proven you can trust him. Now that he's not the number 3 target, he's a far safer play. They're both must starts, in my opinion. Number 16, I have Diontae Johnson at Washington, who gets a top 5 matchup here. The Commanders have been a bit better lately, especially since benching Emmanuel Forbes in the secondary, but they're still bad. They allow 33.7 points per game over the last 5 weeks to opposing wide receivers, an average of 12.6 catches for 165 yards per game and 6 wide receiver touchdowns. I think Diontae will be just fine. While he did fall down to earth against Chicago in week 5, that was a really bad matchup, and he bounced back last week with 10 targets, just like we expected. And over the last 4 games, he's been really good. An average of 15.3 points per game, 10.8 targets per game, 6 catches for 78 yards per game. With 3 touchdowns, he is a focal point in this offense. It's really just him and Chuba Hubbard and almost no one else. Sometimes Legette scores a touchdown, but it's not enough of a threat to worry about Diontae Johnson's floor. So love his value. He's a bust-proof option every week. And in a high-end matchup like this, I think he's a must-start. At number 16, I don't think you can bench him. A very high floor play every single week. Number 17, I have Deebo Samuel versus the Chiefs, and I was really high on him last week. This week, I'm a little bit worried because the matchup is kind of bad. It ranks number 26 this season. In the last 5 games, the Chiefs only give up 22.8 points per game to the position, about 10 catches per game for 112 yards per game, but thankfully 5 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 5 weeks. So the odds he finds the end zone aren't terrible. The matchup, though, historically against Kansas City has not been his best. If you look at the 3 career games for Deebo against the Chiefs, including 2 Super Bowl appearances, he only averages 8.1 points per game on 9 targets per game, 4.3 catches for 59 yards, and not a single touchdown. So the floor is a lot lower this week, but the ceiling is always massive. I could easily envision like a 20-point game for Deebo if he breaks a massive touchdown. So never going to rule him out. I do think I'd rather start him for sure over Brandon Ayuk straight up. But this week I am pumping the brakes. I am lowering expectations. Just a lower end wide receiver 2, not that top 10 play I told you he was last week. I could easily envision a massive game for George Kittle. The Chiefs are bad against tight ends. However, Juwan Jennings did get featured in the Super Bowl back in February, but he is not practicing at the moment with a hip injury that could really open the door in terms of targets in this offense. So Deebo, I don't think you can ever bench, but I'm not expecting his best game of the season. I do think he deserves a slight downgrade against the Chiefs this week. Number 18, I have Brian Thomas Jr. versus the Patriots in London. While he did get shut down last week for less than 30 yards, he's not the first player to be heavily limited by the Chicago Bears secondary. Jalen Johnson is one of the best corners in the NFL. So I'm not reading into the bad game for Thomas too much. I'm not worried about it at all. He's been very explosive this season, and his talent will shine very soon. I'm not worried at all. Christian Gonzalez is a decent corner, though, so maybe he doesn't play his best game of the season, but I do think he will play much better than last week. I'm still starting Thomas because, with the exception of last week, he was trending towards being matchup proof this season. I think he has earned top 20 value going forward, and I definitely don't expect 2 stinkers in back-to-back weeks. Over his last 4 games, Brian Thomas is still averaging 12.8 points per game, 8 targets per game, 4.8 catches for 74 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. He is deadly down the field. So I do think Trevor Lawrence will connect on one of those deep balls. I still trust Brian Thomas. He's a weekly start. I don't think you can bench. He feels destined to break a big play. No matter what, it probably turns into a touchdown in this game. Number 19, I have DK Metcalf at Atlanta, and him and Geno failed to get on the same page last week, but I did mention DK notoriously struggles versus the Niners, but I did not rank him low enough. He did not pay off. They get extra time to prepare, though, heading into this game. They have to travel cross country to face off against Atlanta, but the matchup does not scare you. So DK will probably get back to form. In his last 4 games, he is averaging 10.5 points per game on 9 targets, 4.5 catches, 78 yards per game and a touchdown, but also 2 fumbles. So I really doubt he fumbles again. I would fire him up with confidence. While he is a little touchdown dependent, the volume is there. 9 targets per game keeps his floor very high. I don't think you can ever really bench DK. He feels like a weekly top 20 option this season. Number 20, though, I'm going out on a limb, and I am telling you to start Tyreek Hill this week against the Colts. The matchup ranks top 9. The Colts give up 29.9 points per game to wide receivers over the last 5 weeks. I think Tyreek Hill can exploit them. While I understand that the value has fallen off a cliff with Tyler Huntley at quarterback, I do think off the bye, Tyreek Hill can exploit the Colts defense that is not scary at all. They gave up an 85-yard touchdown to Brian Thomas 2 weeks ago, and I think that could legitimately happen again here with Tyreek Hill. He's just so explosive, so much speed. At some point, the yak will pay off. So I'm not expecting the best game possible from Tyreek. He's definitely not the top 3 wide receiver that you drafted without Tua. However, I do think he pays off. I do think he probably finds the end zone. I think Mike McDaniel will scheme him open and get him the ball early and often. I'm trusting Tyreek this week. Number 21, though, I have DeVonta Smith at the Giants, and he scored a touchdown last week, but only had 4 targets in 2 games with A.J. Brown. He is averaging just under 13 points per game, 12.9, on only 6 targets. So the volume is not quite insane, and he's not quite a focal point of this offense this season. He is giving you 10 points, though, if you remove the touchdown from the equation, and I do think he's going to be fine from a floor standpoint. However, I kind of worry about the ceiling this week. I don't think there's enough volume to fully go around. You know that Saquon is going to score probably multiple touchdowns against his former team, the Giants. A.J. Brown also feels destined to score, so I do think that 4th touchdown might be tricky to hit. I think the ceiling is a bit capped this week while Saquon does dominate the Eagles' game plan. Maybe I'm wrong, but the Giants have been owning time of possession this year, and their defense has played well. I see a potential upset in this matchup, and I think it's because not enough of the Eagles' weapons will be fully incorporated in this game. I think they're going to focus too much on getting Saquon the ball. If you disagree with me, then go ahead and consider DeVonta Smith a top 15 wide receiver. I normally rank him that high, but this week I am bumping him down a few spots. At wide receiver 21, though, I still think you're starting him, and he actually has a much better track record in this matchup against the Giants than A.J. Brown. If you look at the last 5 games for DeVonta against New York, he gives you 14.5 points per game on 7.6 targets per game, 5.4 catches, 70 yards, and 4 touchdowns in this 5-game sample size. So the touchdown probably hits. I might be overblowing my concerns, but I still think you're starting him at wide receiver 21. I am not telling you to bench DeVonta. Number 22. I have T. Higgins at Cleveland, another number 2 wide receiver in his offense, and he gets a good matchup here. On paper, the Browns do give up the 7th most wide receiver points per game over the last 5 weeks. However, against the Browns, Joe Burrow notoriously does struggle. He is not a player that usually wins in this matchup, and that could limit the efficiency overall from the wide receivers in this game. However, on the season, in his last 4 games, T. Higgins is averaging more targets per game than Marr Chase. He gives you 12.6 points per game on 9.3 targets, 6.3 catches, 65 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. He's been excellent since coming back from injury. While he is less explosive, only 10.4 yards per catch, the volume is keeping him viable every single week, and the touchdown odds are pretty decent. It's a good matchup on paper. However, in 5 career games versus the Browns, he has been decent, an average of 8.8 points per game. However, it includes a bagel on 8 targets last season. While Joe Burrow was recovering from that calf injury, T. Higgins was not 100% either. So if we actually throw that game out, he averages 11 points per game in the previous 4 matchups. And I did mention earlier that Marr Chase kind of struggles in this matchup, only an average of 8.9 points per game from Jamar. So it is possible, it wouldn't shock me if T. Higgins actually has the better fantasy game this week, but Jamar has been so lights out lately, I can't rank him that way. But I do think T. Higgins is a very safe play this week, a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end flex play. I will be starting him myself in the subscriber league. T. Higgins looks very good this year. Number 23, I have Jameson Williams at the Vikings, who gets a top 3 matchup on paper. The Vikings give up over 200 yards per game to the wide receiver position over their last 5 weeks. So there's a lot of upside with Jameson Williams in this matchup. He has played very well this season in his last 4 games, an average of 11 points per game on 5 targets, 2.8 catches, 66 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. That does include essentially a bagel from him in week 3. On the season, Jameson Williams is averaging 13.1 points per game, almost identical to Amon-Ra St. Brown's average of 13.3 points per game. So they're both on very similar footing. I definitely prefer St. Brown. I think he could have a massive game in this one that limits Jameson's volume. However, he kind of feels destined to score every single week. He doesn't need a lot of touches in order to break one. His speed has been a massive problem for opposing defenses. So his upside is massive. I think he's a very high-end flex play, and it's hard to bench him. He's just played so well this season, and it kind of feels like this game is a likely shootout against the Vikings. So I'm going to fire him up as well in the subscriber league. I have Jared Goff as my starting quarterback, and I want that stack. I think I'm starting Jared Goff and Jameson Williams in the subscriber league this week. At number 24, I have Amari Cooper versus Tennessee, and he gets such a breath of fresh air moving over from the Deshaun Watson Browns, now playing for the Josh Allen Bills. He's going to be way better, and I'm sure he feels great with the potential to compete for a Super Bowl. This is a very good team, much better than Cleveland, and I think he will slide in perfectly as the Stefon Diggs replacement. He's very reliable, and they probably get him a touchdown in his first game with the team just to welcome him to the party, get him feeling confident and comfortable early on. So I think he definitely scores. I think the floor is very high for him. And the offense, while it is a little crowded, was kind of desperate for a number 1 wide receiver. So while I'm not expecting 10 plus targets right out the gate for him, I do think that's in the cards. It is possible. However, the matchup is bad against the Titans. It ranks bottom 3. In their last 5 games, the Titans have only given up 18.9 points per game to opposing wide receivers. So not the best spot here against L'Jarius Sneed. It is a downgrade, but I wouldn't be shocked to rank Amari Cooper top 12 rest of season. I think he's a excellent play moving forward, and you got to be ecstatic. I think the only way you're benching him is if you have like elite wide receiver depth on your fantasy roster. I think Amari Cooper is a weekly lock in your lineup now that he's a Buffalo Bill. You got to feel very excited about the rest of his season. Number 25, though, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. versus the Chargers, who is questionable at the moment. He's in the concussion protocol as of this recording. So he might get cleared in time. He might not. He might not play on Monday night. And the fact that it's the last game of the week offers very high risk because you would have limited options to pivot to if he does get ruled out before the game kicks off. So not ideal. I think we will get some clarity before Monday morning, however. So I don't think it's the worst situation imaginable. He's either going to clear it by Saturday or not. So I think he'll play, and he has been very good this season in his last 4 full games, not counting last week where he exited in the middle of the second quarter. He's giving you 14.9 points per game, 8 targets, 4 catches per game for 69 yards per game, and 4 touchdowns. Definitely starting him if active. However, if he doesn't play, it would be a bagel from him, and you might get burned if you wait till Monday night without an option to pivot to. So there aren't the best options either at flex in that matchup. You're either getting Michael Wilson or a Chargers wide receiver. Maybe you can pivot to Zay Flowers instead in the other Monday game. So monitor his status. It's very important that he actually suits up. I'm not convinced it happens, but even if he does deserve a downgrade in this matchup. It ranks bottom 6. The Chargers only give up 22.2 points per game to the opposing wide receivers this season, an average of 128 yards per game on under 9 catches per game. So not great. I'm not convinced Harrison has his best game of the season. He does deserve a downgrade, but it's mainly because of the concussion. I think if he plays, if he's active, you are starting him in your lineup. You drafted him too high to kind of bench him. Number 26, though, I have Brandon Ayuk versus the Chiefs, and I'm a little more encouraged with this ranking now that Juwan Jennings is not practicing. However, in 2 career games versus the Chiefs, one of them was in the Super Bowl last year, Ayuk is only averaging 9.1 points per game on 8.5 targets, 5 catches, 66 yards per game, and not a single touchdown. So the Chiefs are excellent at locking up #1 wide receivers. I'm not quite sure if Trent McDuffie will travel in this game, but odds are he probably spends most of the time shadowing Brandon Ayuk. So he could definitely get shut down, but maybe they focus more on Deebo. It's kind of a toss-up which one will have a bad game. I do not think both play well, and Ayuk has not been good this season. In his last 4 games, only averaging 9.1 points per game. There's really only one game this year where he's been good, so not a single touchdown still, and I'm not convinced it happens in this matchup. I think he actually has a lot of risk. He has not been safe at all this season, so I think it's a gamble. I don't think he's a lock in your lineup, but as a high-end flex option, I think odds are you will start him. There's a chance this turns into a shootout against the Chiefs. I doubt it, and if it does, I think this is much more of a better matchup for George Kittle than either of the receivers. I worry about Ayuk. I do not think this is his best game of the year. But at number 27, I have Garrett Wilson at Pittsburgh, who falls kind of dramatically now that Davante Adams enters the offense. And I'm not completely panicking, but you have to be a bit worried given he's being demoted to the number 2 option. Obviously, it hurts his volume, but I think he's going to be way more open as well down the field, and that could open up some high-value targets that lead to touchdowns. So Adams will demand the most attention. I'm not going to tell you that Garrett Wilson doesn't lose value. However, I think at worst, he's going to offer the same value as last season with Zach Wilson, and that was a weekly top 30 wide receiver, high-end flex value, and the volume still probably hovers around 8+ targets per game. So I think he'll be okay, but the one variable that has me very concerned is the fact that Allen Lazard is not just going to disappear. I do think that infatuation with Lazard, especially in the red zone that Rodgers has, could be a problem, and it will be annoying as fuck if you roster Garrett Wilson. So he definitely moves down, but I still think he's a legit flex play. He's very talented, and the Steelers defense, while it is a bottom 10 matchup for opposing wide receivers, will have their hands full trying to stop Adams. I do think Garrett Wilson will get open plenty of times on Sunday night. So I still think you're starting him, but good luck. I'm worried about his value rest of season. I'm not quite sure I'll be ranking him ever inside the top 20, but I doubt I rank him outside the top 30 either. I think he's going to be a fine flex play, high-end upside, but not the safest floor given the crowded target share in New York. Number 28, right behind him, I have Darnell Mooney versus Seattle, and Mooney has been outstanding this year. In his last 4 games, an average of 12.5 points per game, 8.8 targets per game, high volume, 5.8 receptions for 66 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. While a lot of these stats did come against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, while Cousins threw for 500 yards, Mooney is consistently targeted at a higher rate than Kyle Pitts. He is the number 2 target in this offense, and that earns him weekly flex consideration. He has massive upside in this offense, and Devon Witherspoon is a very good corner who's likely going to shadow Drake London. So if Tyreek Woolen is out for the 2nd week in a row, then Mooney could capitalize. I think he has a very high ceiling this week. He's a very good play. Moving forward, I think at worst, he'd be like top 35. I think he'll crack the top 25 pretty often this season. Number 29 and 28, though, back-to-back for the Chiefs. I got Xavier Worthy and Juju Smith-Schuster on the road at San Francisco. The bye week really helps Xavier Worthy, in my opinion. He's still coming along. He's just a rookie at the end of the day, but they need him to develop quickly because this offense is lacking depth with all of the injuries on their roster. Andy Reid will take advantage of his speed in this game. I think it could resemble Jameson Williams in the NFC Championship game against the Niners last year, where on only like 3 or 4 touches, Worthy could break like a 50-yard house call and could have 2 deep touchdowns. His speed will be on display in this matchup. So I think Reid is going to have a very fun time getting him involved this week, but it might be on limited volume. That's my main concern with Worthy. In week 5, the last time we saw him, he did score a rushing touchdown, but only had 3 catches for 28 total yards in that game. He wasn't like a dominant number 1 wide receiver getting 10+ targets. Worthy is not designed to do that. He's just built differently. He's only 165 pounds, and they can't really afford to lose him. So not expecting the world from him, but I do think when he gets the ball, it will be explosive. His upside is huge, and that's why I'm starting him. He does average 8.1 points per game over his last 4, but I think this week it could be over 14. I think he will score a touchdown in this matchup, I would like to start Worthy this week against the Niners. I'd also like to start Juju in the same matchup. That's why I have them ranked back-to-back. I think they have kind of equal value moving forward, unless they add a veteran piece to this offense. So unless they trade for like DeAndre Hopkins or someone like that, then Juju is the best replacement they have for Rashee Rice. And in week 5, the last time we saw him, he scored 16.5 points on 8 targets, 7 catches for 130 yards without a touchdown. That is excellent for fantasy. So love Juju at the moment. I think he's a must pick up off the wire. If he's still available, go and get him right now. Do not wait. He is a huge asset in fantasy rest of season. So I expect him to be involved heavily every week. I'm not expecting 100 plus yards all the time, but 2 years ago, when he filled in for Tyreek Hill in this offense and helped them win a Super Bowl, he was also a top 30 wide receiver before some concussions kind of messed up the back half of his season. He was very consistently involved before those concussions. So I think it'll remain the same. I think like 2 weeks ago, Juju Smith-Schuster has high upside, a decent floor, and he's a weekly flex play moving forward. He is a very valuable piece on your roster. Number 31, I have Ladd McConkey at Arizona, who gets a top 10 matchup here. The Cardinals allow just under 30 points per game to wide receivers in their last 5, allowing 12.8 catches per game, 149 yards per game, and 6 wide receiver touchdowns overall. So McConkey gets an upgrade. While he did briefly leave last week's game with an injury, he did come back, and at the moment he's off the injury report, so he's good to go. I'm not worried about him missing any time on Monday. He gets an excellent matchup, and I think the pseudo prime time game here does mean that Justin Herbert is going to flex that arm talent a bit more than we've seen this season. I think Justin Herbert will have a good game, and Ladd McConkey is their number 1 target in his last 4 games, averaging 7.8 points per game on 6.3 targets per game. The volume isn't massive, but it is consistent, and he is a consistent target in the red zone as well. He has scored 1 touchdown over his last 4, a total of 2 on the season. He's getting the most targets consistently, and I do think the upside is there. I do think a Chargers receiver plays well in this matchup. The best bet would be McConkey. So I think he's a good flex play this week. I think he deserves an upgrade. Maybe it's my Chargers bias, but I do think he's worth a start in the flex conversation in week 7. Number 32, I have Courtland Sutton at the Saints, who also gets a good matchup. New Orleans ranks number 11 for opposing wide receivers, giving up just under 30 points per game as well, an average of 182 receiving yards per game to the position. So I think Sutton's floor is going to be very high this week. I think he does play well, and in his last 4 games, he has been pretty decent. An average of 10.3 points per game is a solid floor. 7.8 targets, 4 catches, 53 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. While he's not scoring at a touchdown rate the same as last year, that was pretty unsustainable, and he is doing okay this season with Bo Nix. He's clearly the number 1 target in Denver, and in Sean Payton's return to New Orleans in primetime, I do think Bo Nix is going to play well. Sean Payton wants to showcase his new quarterback. So it's a good matchup on paper. I think the floor is very high for Sutton, and he's the best bet in this offense to score a touchdown. So very legit flex play this week. I think Sutton deserves some consideration. At wide receiver 32, I don't think he's a bad start at all. Number 33, I have Jakobi Meyers at the Rams, who is technically questionable. He did not play last week, but is expected to return at least to practice in week 7. And he actually has at least 9 targets in each of his last 3 games. He has been consistently involved with no Davante Adams, who officially has left the building. Adams is now a Jet. So Meyers is the clear number 1 wide receiver alongside tight end Brock Bowers, and I envision a high floor for him weekly thanks to consistent volume. However, this offense is not exciting with their quarterback situation. The Rams were a good matchup early in the year, but have gotten better the last few weeks. They just rank average at the moment. So Meyers is fine. It's not a downgrade here. And in his last 4 games, he is averaging 9.6 points per game on 8.3 targets, 5.5 catches, 53 yards, and 1 touchdown. I'm not convinced he finds the end zone, but he does offer a safe floor that warrants flex consideration every single week moving forward. I think he's going to be consistently ranked somewhere between wide receiver 30 and 35. If it's an elite matchup, maybe he cracks the top 25, but odds are he stays right around here, number 33 most of the time. So consider him if you need him, but odds are you're always a little disappointed to have him in your lineup. No one's ever excited to start a wide receiver who plays with Aiden O'Connell. Number 34, though, I have Jaxon Smith-Njigba at Atlanta, and I was right to rank Lockett above him last week against the Niners. But on the year, I do think JSN is the more valuable player. They have a mini bye to game plan for this matchup, and off 3 straight losses, I think they're hungry to play well. They need to get JSN going if they want their offense to live up to its potential. He has one good game this year versus the Patriots. Otherwise, he kind of maxes out at about 50 yards. But I think he scores a touchdown this week, and his floor is usually safe for about 8 or 9 points. So he's a good flex option moving forward. It's just not the safest bet for the ceiling to hit. You're just hoping that Lockett doesn't get in the way, but this season, in his last 4 games, JSN is averaging 8.4 points per game with only 1 touchdown in the sample size. There's not that much risk with JSN. There's just not that much upside either. So good luck in the low-end flex conversation. I do think he's fine to start, but maybe not my favorite option. I do think there's some better players to go chasing touchdowns with. I have ranked a little bit higher. Number 35, though, I have DeMario Douglas at Jacksonville, and this is an elite matchup here in London. The Jags rank top 2. They allow 36.3 points per game to wide receivers over the last 5 weeks. 16.2 catches per game, 183 yards per game, alongside 8 touchdowns to the position in 5 games. So love this spot for Douglas. And at this point, the risk factor is there with every player in the rankings. So why not chase matchups? Douglas gets an elite one this week. And so far, he's been the only relevant wide receiver in the Patriots offense. Drake May flashed some upside last week. And even if he turns it over again 3 times, it's just going to lead to more garbage time once again. So I genuinely see some decent upside for the Patriots' #1 wide receiver every week. And at the moment, it looks like that's DeMario Douglas. I genuinely think this game is competitive. I actually picked the Patriots to win. And Douglas, in his last 4 games, has been pretty solid. An average of 10.3 points per game on 7.5 targets per game, 5.5 catches per game, 61 yards per game, and a touchdown. He finally found the end zone. He has never done that before last week. So I do think there's some appeal with DeMario Douglas. Drake May makes this offense a lot more fantasy relevant, and until Jalen Polk establishes himself, I think DeMario has legit starting value as their top wideout. It's a good matchup, so I do trust the floor, and the upside is there. Douglas has 9 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. He's a very solid flex play. Number 36, I have Christian Kirk versus the Patriots in the same game in London. And I think this team is giving up, honestly. They're playing very soft football at the moment. I don't think anything changes until the coach gets fired. But the matchup is not terrible. Kirk has been decent recently as well. In his last 4 games, an average of 10.9 points per game on 8 targets per game. That's the same amount as Brian Thomas, 5.5 catches for 67 yards per game, and 1 touchdown. His safe 10-point floor is back, and that's what he's offered the last 2 seasons as well in the Jags offense. He's a very bust-proof option, usually averages about 10 to 11 points per game. So he's going to continue to see this type of volume. I think you can start him with a relative amount of confidence. He's just a floor play, though, but you're never going to get burned with a bagel with Christian Kirk. He struggled the first couple weeks, but now he's on track, and I do think he's a fine floor play every single week moving forward. At 37, though, I have Wan'Dale Robinson versus the Eagles, and Wan'Dale continues to see a high target share this season. In his last 4 games, he's averaging 10.7 points per game on 10.5 targets per game, 7.3 catches per game, 55 yards and a touchdown, but he is simply a check down machine. His yards per catch average this season is only 7.6 yards per reception, and that's nothing to brag about. He's more valuable in full PPR, but the floor is consistently solid every single week thanks to all of that volume, and I do expect Nabers to go off this week, but Robinson is still usable no matter what. While Slayton has earned more of a role going forward, they both have very different roles in this offense, and I do think they can both coexist alongside each other, even if Slayton is involved weekly. So Wan'Dale is a reliable floor play no matter what. He's a weekly top 40 option because of this volume. I'm never dying to start him. I don't think there's that much upside, but even without a touchdown, I think you can get 8 points pretty safely with Wan'Dale. Number 38, I have Jordan Addison versus Detroit, and it's kind of a gamble with Addison every single week. He has massive upside. He can kind of score from anywhere. However, the volume is not great. In 3 games this season, Addison is averaging 10.5 points per game on 5.3 targets per game, 3 catches for 50 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. It's nothing special, but when it does hit, he does have a massive, massive ceiling. You have to balance some risk, obviously. I do not think he's the safest play, but you know that Jefferson is going to demand a lot of attention from the defense. Meanwhile, TJ Hawkinson might return, and in a revenge game, they're probably going to try and stop him as well. So I could easily envision Detroit forgetting about Addison on a few plays, and he slips past them for a massive game. If it turns into a touchdown, you will not regret starting him at all. So while he is a bit boom bust, I think once we cross wide receiver 30, that's kind of the name of the game. But of all the players outside the top 30 so far that I have ranked, I think he probably has the most upside of these 8 guys. So not the highest floor, but he could easily be the best play. If the ceiling hits, you will be happy with Addison's production. So good luck, you're going to need it, but it's not the worst option if you are swinging for the fence. At 39, though, I have George Pickens versus the Jets, and I think this is the cutoff point. I think I'm benching Pickens this week because the matchup is brutal against the Jets. They rank bottom 4, only giving up 4 touchdowns to wide receivers this season and less than 100 yards per game to the position. So really not excited about this Sauce Gardner matchup. I could envision the quarterback, whoever it is, whether it's Russ or Justin Fields, just completely avoiding Sauce Gardner all game long, and that could very much impact Pickens' stat line. This season, he's been a decent floor play, averaging 8 points per game on 8.3 targets, 4.5 catches, 62 yards per game, but not a single touchdown on the season. So the floor is okay, but the ceiling has yet to hit. He needs to go over 100 yards to give you more than 10 points. And this is not the matchup I'm expecting that to happen. So while he does offer some upside, there's definitely some appeal. I don't feel great about it, and I don't think he offers that ceiling in this game. So I'm trying to bench him. The volume is pretty consistent, but in this game, I think it could fall off a cliff. And I'm not quite sure if the change at quarterback to Russell Wilson would actually help him or not. I really have no idea how that impacts the value for Pickens and Freiermuth in this offense. So maybe more checkdowns, maybe more red zone targets as well, but probably a lot fewer deep targets. I think Fields is better down the field than Russell Wilson. So really hard to estimate what we're getting from Pickens this week, but at number 39 in a terrible matchup, I think you should bench him. I'm also going to bench Michael Pittman versus the Dolphins, who I have ranked here at number 40 in a terrible matchup. The Dolphins actually rank bottom 2 this season, only giving up 18.7 points per game to opposing wide receivers, an average of 8.8 catches per game for 116 yards per game, only 2 wide receiver touchdowns on the year. So really not a good matchup. And Pittman is nowhere near as valuable with Richardson at quarterback. I'm not going to completely panic. I think it's overblown sometimes in regards to how bad this offense is with Richardson under center. I still think Pittman is a good player, and he should probably get about 7 or 8 targets. That's what he was getting in his first 3 games with Richardson at quarterback. So he's okay. The matchup is not good, however, and there's a lot of risk that it just doesn't work out. I could see them leaning heavily on the run with Taylor expected to be back and the Dolphins unable to stop anyone on the ground this season. So Pittman is a low-end flex play this week. I'd probably rank him top 30 if not for the bad matchup, but against the Dolphins, I will pass. I think Jalen Ramsey could lock him up. Right behind him, though, I have Josh Downs in the same game at number 41 against the Dolphins. I do think Josh Downs is like equally as valuable as Pittman, though. It's kind of a toss-up which player of the two will see the most targets. Most of these stats I'm about to show you are with Flacco at quarterback, but in his last 4 games, Josh Downs is averaging 12.3 points per game on 8.8 targets per game, 6.8 catches, 60 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. That's pretty good, but it's kind of reliant on Flacco. There's a lot of checkdowns here, and that is not Richardson's strong suit. So I'm not expecting these stats to repeat. I only think one of these wide receivers can be viable, and it's kind of a coin flip which of the 2 players does actually play well. It's either Pittman or Downs, and it could possibly be neither of them if Alec Pierce dominates once again. So that's not what I'm hoping for, but it is possible. One of Downs or Pittman should be fine, but picking the right one is very difficult, and that's why I'm probably just going to bench both of them. I feel it's a bit too risky in a bad matchup against Miami. Number 42, a very similar player to Downs, is Tyler Lockett at the Falcons, and he was the best Seahawks wide receiver last week in fantasy, but I do not expect that to be the case often this year. He does have the same amount of targets as JSN though over the last 4 games, but I expect the offense to pivot in favor of the other weapons coming off the loss, their 3rd straight last week against the Niners. So he's a relatively fine floor play, but I just don't think the upside is here this week. The matchup is not excellent, but it's not bad either. I think Lockett is a low-end flex play. I'd rather just bench him. I don't think he goes over 8 or 9 points this week against the Falcons. Number 43 and 44, though, back-to-back, I have Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson of the Packers versus the Texans this week. Dontavian Wicks is banged up, and Reed is slightly banged up as well, and we saw both of these players capitalize last week while they were injured. They definitely have high upside. It's just a matter of predicting when those touchdowns will hit. The problem is neither player gets much volume. They both scored at least 1 touchdown last week. However, both guys only had 4 targets and 3 catches apiece. So you can definitely get burned if the touchdown is not there, but if you're willing to take a chance, they also have 20-point upside if you're lucky. I'd roster them, but starting them is a risky bet every week. And Watson, while he is the more explosive player, I do think I prefer Doubs straight up. Doubs has more targets this season. He's the better floor play and doesn't come with as much injury risk as Christian Watson does. Watson could leave the game at any point with an injury. So that's why I do prefer Doubs. I rank him 1 spot higher. He also scored 8 touchdowns last year. And while you think the touchdown odds are higher with Watson, I think they're actually very even with both guys. I think it's kind of a gamble with both. It's just a matter of how lucky do you feel? Are you willing to play the slot machine on the Packers receivers? Good luck if you do that. Number 45, I have Tutu Atwell versus Las Vegas, and it does not appear that Puka Nacua will play until week 8. So that means one of these backup Rams receivers will slot in as the number 2 guy. It's a gamble, though, to decide on which one, but I prefer Atwell if I am taking that shot. He's played the best lately of the bunch in his last 4 games, an average of 8.8 points per game, without any touchdowns. So the floor has been decent for him, and it's possible I'm wrong. Maybe Whittington is the guy they want to further develop, given he's a rookie. But I think one of these players will offer value beyond Cooper Kupp, and I do think there is a good game looming for one of the other Rams receivers. But my pick is Tutu Atwell. I could easily be wrong. There's plenty of risk involved, and I get it if you just want to drop him. He loses all value once Puka Nacua returns next week. Number 46, I have Jaylen Waddle at the Colts, and while I am confident enough to tell you to start Tyreek Hill this week, I am not confident enough to tell you to start both Tyreek and Waddle. I do not trust Tyler Huntley to torch the Colts with both of these players, and that's why I'm benching Waddle. I just don't think there's enough volume to work out. I don't think both players score a touchdown, and it's really just Tyreek Hill who can exploit them because of his speed. I know Waddle is fast as well, but I just don't see enough volume for him. In his last 4 games, he's only averaging 5.3 points per game on only 5.8 targets, 33 yards per game, no touchdowns. Waddle feels like he's way too risky to start. You're just hoping that Tua comes back soon. Number 47, I have Xavier Legette at Washington, and the matchup ranks top 5. Legette is not a terrible bet to find the end zone this week either. You feel way safer, though, with Diontae Johnson getting far more volume, but the rookie first-round pick has talent, and he is gaining confidence as the weeks roll by. He's now scored 2 touchdowns on the season, but I'm still not dying to start him. I'm just interested in rostering him for long-term upside, but you could do a lot worse than Legette. Over his last 4 games, he's averaging 8.2 points per game with only 4.5 targets per game, but 3 catches for 37 yards and 2 touchdowns. The touchdown is what I'm chasing. The Commanders are a decent matchup to do that with. Number 48, though, I have Michael Wilson versus the Chargers, and if Marvin Harrison is ruled out with a concussion, then Wilson would move up significantly in the rankings. But even as the number 2 wideout, he's got some appeal. It's not a good matchup, though, for Harrison, and maybe Wilson does break free in the end zone. That's all you're hoping for, really, but Michael Wilson in his last 4 games, just like Legette, is averaging 8.3 points per game. There is more volume headed his way, but less touchdown production. You're really hoping for the touchdown. Without it, you're not going to go over 6 or 7 points. So no thanks. I'm probably going to bench him, but he is interesting, especially if Harrison is ruled out. Number 49 and 50, though, I have Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, the 2 Titans wide receivers on the road at Buffalo. The matchup is bottom 10. The Bills rank number 25, only allowing 23.1 points per game on 11.8 catches per game, 148 yards per game, and only 3 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 5 games. So not a great spot, but I don't feel good about this offense in general. Last week was so gross for Ridley. He had 8 targets, 0 catches. He avoided the bagel with 9 rushing yards, but it might as well have been a full-blown bagel. So you cannot trust any option in this offense other than Tony Pollard, honestly. Levis only threw for 95 yards last week, and it could easily happen again. I wouldn't be shocked to see it happen. So the matchup is why I'm not confident in either player, but I think both of them offer so much risk. They're both extremely touchdown dependent, and I'd rather just avoid it. But over the last 4 games, the better option has actually been DeAndre Hopkins. In his last 4, averaging 7.3 points per game on only 4.8 targets per game. But Ridley is giving you 6.8 points per game on 5 targets per game. So it's pretty much a 1A, 1B situation, and neither of them offers much upside. They're extremely touchdown dependent, and it's very unlikely that you pick correctly with each player. So I'm benching both of them. Honestly, I think you could drop both players if you really wanted to. There's a potential trade looming for DeAndre Hopkins if this team really has no shot at competing. They could make a move at the deadline. Hopefully, he could go to the Kansas City Chiefs. That would be the ideal landing spot, but it's not guaranteed to actually happen. And until it does, they're actually pretty good landmines to leave on the waiver wire for your opponents to deal with. If I see Ridley or Hopkins on my opponent's starting roster, I feel very confident in my chances of winning. The odds that they blow up in their face are very high, and they could legitimately put up a bagel in any given matchup. So not starting either of them. I think both of them are liabilities in your lineup, and I don't think you have to roster them if you don't want to. I told you not to draft either guy entering the year. These last 10, though, I'm going to go kind of quickly just to mention them. They are players I'm keeping my eye on, but I'm not expecting very much from them unless they vulture the touchdown from the wide receiver above them on their team. At number 51, I have Khalil Shakir versus Tennessee, and Amari Cooper coming into town obviously hurts his value. Shakir plays mostly in the slot. Cooper plays out wide, though, so they can coexist, and this might open up a lot more space for Shakir in the middle of the field. With a lot less defensive attention, I do think Shakir is still worth holding on to for at least a week. I want to see what this offense looks like. And in this offense, there's always enough upside for multiple players to get going, even on the fringes of the roster. So Shakir, I'm not giving up on, but obviously it moves down heavily in the rankings with the addition of Amari Cooper. And at 52, I have Quentin Johnston at Arizona. It's a good matchup for Herbert. I do think there's some touchdowns to be had in the passing game on Monday night. McConkey is the safest bet, but we've seen QJ score 3 touchdowns this season. He could definitely do it again. He does have some appeal. However, he's dealing with an ankle injury from last week. At the moment, he's off the injury report, though, so he should be fine. I think he will play on Monday. Number 53, I have Jalen Polk at Jacksonville, who has not proven anything yet, but there is opportunity in this offense that is suddenly a lot more interesting for fantasy now that Drake May is the quarterback. I prefer DeMario Douglas, but last week Kayshon Boutte was the number 3 target behind Polk, and the touchdown went to Boutte. I think it could easily pivot to Polk soon enough. So Polk should emerge very soon. He's a very sneaky pickup off of the wire. Despite only averaging 3.1 points per game this season, he could emerge as the guy above DeMario. I wouldn't be shocked at all if that happened. Number 54, I have Allen Lazard at Pittsburgh, and I'm not convinced he's going to just disappear now that Adams is in town. Mike Williams is done, but Lazard could honestly have just as many targets and fantasy points as Garrett Wilson moving forward. He's 6'5", and he probably continues to see consistent targets in the end zone. He's going to be annoying as fuck to watch if you have Garrett Wilson. Lazard is still a threat. I would not write him off entirely. At 55, I have Darius Slayton versus Philly, and at this point, it's mainly just like DFS appeal, but he played well the last couple games without Nabers. I think they have a similar deep threat role that obviously impacts Slayton's value, but he has good chemistry with Daniel Jones, and I think he's earned more work in this offense. If he does stay on the field a decent amount, he could randomly break a deep house call at any time. We'll see if he goes back to irrelevance, though, this week. I want to see if Nabers back on the field completely eradicates Slayton's snap share. 56, though, I have Gabe Davis versus the Patriots in London, and he scored 2 touchdowns last week, but with Evan Ingram back on the field, he is now pushed to the number 4 target in this offense. You knew when you drafted him, he has boom-bust upside, but it's very hard to predict when that potential is there. I'm going to pass. I think it's way too risky with Gabe Davis. I'm also going to pass on Ray McLeod versus Seattle, but I am keeping an eye on him. Sometimes he's more involved than Kyle Pitts, and I think you'll see his name in this 50 to 60 range all year long. He is averaging 5.8 targets per game. Number 58, I have Andre Yoshivas at Cleveland, and Yoshi is clearly the number 3 target for Joe Burrow. He has only 1 game this year with over 50 yards, but he also has 3 touchdowns on the season. So he's just a dart throw, but not the worst you can find. At 59, I think you're also just gambling for a touchdown with Jalen McMillan. The best wide receiver matchup in the NFL would be the Ravens, who is his opponent this week. So maybe Jalen McMillan slips past the defense for a touchdown. It has happened multiple times this year. Otherwise, though, there is no value for the rookie. Lastly, though, I want to mention Juwan Jennings versus Kansas City, who is now questionable. I wanted to rank him a lot higher, honestly, given how well he played in the Super Bowl back in February, but he missed practice today with a hip injury, and he's not guaranteed to play on Sunday. So he's got some sneaky upside if he does, but if he misses the game, you're obviously dropping him if you haven't already done so. If he's hurt, he's irrelevant for fantasy. So those are my wide receiver rankings this week. I have the top 60 here on the screen, and I think the players you're really counting on the most would be the top 37. I feel really good about the top 14 wide receivers this week. I think they're all locks in your lineup all the way through Stefon Diggs. They feel guaranteed to find the end zone, and the volume should be there. I think they're all excellent plays this week. Wide receiver should have a lot of value. There's some ideal matchups as well for the studs at the position. So expect 20 plus points from the top 7, honestly. I think you're getting 16 plus from the top 14. I think you're getting 12 plus from the top 27. And I think you're also getting 9.5, 10 points plus from the top 37. Wide receiver is loaded this week. And now that it's getting a little bit healthier with a guy like Cooper Kupp back, it is more intriguing. So that is it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. This one has run a lot longer than I hoped for, so I'm just going to end it here. My name's Adam Riancho. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.